somehow he could turn a phrase and he could say something and he could make you laugh.
One of the most inspiring men I ever met in my life.
He knew the horror of war firsthand, knew what it was like to be shot at, knew what it was like to have a ship sunk under him.
He was rather an incandescent man who could light the fuses of people around him.
An idealist without illusions.
I remember him as someone so full of ideas and energy and fun and excitement. The funniest man I knew.
His voice is still very much in my ears, and certainly his face, his smile are very much in my eyes.
No man ever made such an impact on this country or in the world in such a short time.
The past is a paradox. Gone, it survives in what we think and what we do. The elected leaders who once shaped our world still move in our minds and memories. Through them, we defined ourselves, created the measure of what we are. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's role in our national history was brief, yet he remains an enduring presence, a figure from the bright, brave days of our beginnings. In him we found again our half-forgotten youth, glimpsed once more a common dream. Now we shall retrace his journey into history, told through the recollections of some of those who knew him best. A high moment of that journey happened here, at this empty stadium in Los Angeles, in the distant summer of 1960.
Mr. Chairman, are the aisles cleared of all those participating in the preceding demonstration? Mr. Chairman, do I hear the Mr. Chairman, delegate from Minnesota? Mr. Chairman, this is Senator Humphrey. Mr. Chairman, for what purpose does the delegate rise?
The delegate rises to inform the chairman that the governor of Minnesota is on the platform prepared to nominate Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts and...
Thank you.
And with the chair...
Thank you.
And would the chair please introduce the governor?
Ladies and gentlemen, the delegates of this convention, it is my distinct honor to present to you at this time the Honorable Orville Freeman, Governor of Minnesota. Mr. Chairman, delegates to this convention and guests, the man I am privileged to place in nomination here is a man who has proven that he can and will make the decisions that must be made so that we can do the job that has to be done at this critical time. We must face a great responsibility, and the man who can lead us to meet that responsibility, to lead us to a fruitful America, to a peaceful world for mankind everywhere, is the great senator from the state of Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy.
I think it would be fair to say that Jack Kennedy really didn't know very much about this country until the presidential primary. And I think that's true of a lot of contenders. It's a big and complicated country. I think Jack Kennedy perhaps knew more about England than he knew about the U.S.
On the long road to the Democratic Convention, John Kennedy had just completed a crash course in American street corner politics. In primaries that spanned the country, he had enlisted his wife, Jacqueline, quickly known as Jackie among the voters, and invited the public to cozy little get-togethers on television.
Good morning. First, let me thank you for joining us for a cup of coffee today. We hope that the next 30 minutes will be pleasant ones for you. My husband will be here in a few minutes, and if you've any questions you would like to ask him, we have set up time.
She was a great asset in Wisconsin and West Virginia, that as many men would stand in line to shake Jackie's hand as women did to shake Jack's.
We can expect that the demand will also go up, so I think we can reverse the downward trend. Why did you change your haircut? Well, I didn't change my haircut. That's really one of those rumors that started in the campaign, say that I did, but I regret to say that I didn't, but maybe I should. The question is, if elected, how would you handle the Cuban problem? I must say that in regard to Cuba, that I agree with the administration's handling of it.
A relative newcomer on the national scene, seeking to prove his vote-getting prowess, Kennedy challenged other rivals to face him in primaries.
I think what would be the greatest mistake would be for the Democrats to try to select a candidate who had not been willing to run in various primaries across the country in the spring. If he can't win a primary today in this state and other states, he can't beat Mr. Nixon in November.
The only major contender to answer the challenge was Hubert Humphrey, first in Wisconsin, later in West Virginia.
Hubert was a wonderful man, but he was totally disorganized. He kind of liked to do what he liked to do. He liked to talk as long as he wanted to talk.
Yes, sir, I want to say that I feel very much like Harry Truman did just a night or so before the election in 1948. And I have a feeling that somebody's apt to be feeling like Dewey the day after the election. And you know, that was anything but a happy feeling.
I am one of two candidates in the primary in West Virginia. There are no delegates.
John Kennedy was in Virginia, and he knew where the people were. He brought in sophisticated pollers. He had it all organized.
But now Kennedy would confront a silent, treacherous, and half-hidden foe that threatened all his gains.
We had sent Lou Harris to do a poll in West Virginia, and he came back with a poll showing that we'd win West Virginia by 70-30. And about 3 days after we were in, announced we were in, we had him do another poll, but this time we had him add the factor that John Kennedy was a Catholic. And we got a poll back which absolutely knocked us off the boards because it said we were going to lose the state by 70-30. And now we were in over our neck in there, and we had to figure out how to win. And we decided that we ought to address the Catholic issue straight on.
You would be divided between two loyalties to your church and to your state if you were to be elected president.
The question is whether I think that if I were elected president, I would be divided between two loyalties, my church and my state. Let me just say that I would not. I have sworn to uphold the Constitution in the 14 years I've been in Congress.
And in that month, we turned that state around from a 30-70 deficit to a 60-40 advantage.
One of the things which I sponsored was to take it out of the Department of Agriculture and put it in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. A lot of this...
He got through that primary, and he'd been at mine heads and shops and corners at 4 o'clock in the morning and going until 12 at night, and shaking hands with people everywhere. Why, he knew this country. And it came out again and again and again in the decisions he made. So he was a fast learner.
Across the hinterland of America, Kennedy had made his sweep of the primaries, proved he could gather votes despite his Back Bay accent, his tailored look, his Catholicism.
The great issue is how we can demonstrate that a free society, with its freedom of choice, its breadth of...
Now one of those nominated at the Democratic Convention, he still faced formidable rivals in Adlai Stevenson, already once a candidate, and Lyndon Johnson, a powerful Senate leader, while Kennedy was still a schoolboy. Yet competing for the votes of the delegates, Johnson quickly found himself outmaneuvered when he pointed to Kennedy's poor attendance record in Washington.
6 days and nights I had to deliver a quorum of 51 men on a moment's notice to keep the Senate in session to get any bill at all. And I'm proud to tell you that on those 50 quorum calls, Lyndon Johnson answered every one of them. Although some men who would be president on a civil rights platform answered none. Senator Johnson, let me just say that I appreciate what Senator Johnson had to say. He made some general references to perhaps the shortcomings of other presidential candidates, but as he was not specific, I assume he was talking about some of the other candidates and not about me. So I come to you today full of admiration for Senator Johnson, full of affection for him, strongly in support of him for majority leader, and I'm confident that in that position, we're all going to be able to work together. Thank you.
In frantic, smoke-filled rooms, Kennedy and his team of young strategists continued to woo and win delegates long into the night. The next day would bring success or failure to their years of effort, as state by state the roll call of delegates' votes began.
Senator Johnson, 3 1/2 votes. Senator Kennedy, 104 1/2 votes. Senator Symington, 2 1/2 votes. Governor Stevenson, 3 1/2 votes.
Working the floor, Robert Kennedy continued pressure on each state delegation until at last 11 of Wyoming's 15 votes would bring a Kennedy victory.
Wyoming's vote will make a majority for Senator Kennedy.
The Democratic delegates had turned to the vision of a younger man. Now, in the wider battle to come, he faced sterner tests. He had won the allegiance of his own party. He still had to win the confidence of the nation at large.
All of us in this room and across the country are united together in our devotion to this country. We wish to keep it strong, and we wish to keep it free. It requires, at this critical time, the best of all of us. And I can assure all of you here who have reposed this confidence in me that I will be worthy of your trust. We will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
The political traditions of the Kennedy family were old and deep, and they began here, close to the echoing ship sirens and bird cries of Boston Harbor. Fleeing the Irish potato famine of the 1850s, Patrick Kennedy opened a tavern amid the other newly arrived immigrants in the city's 11th district. Then, in a startling leap from obscurity, the bar owner quickly became a state senator and owner of a bank. His son, Joseph, would inherit the benefits. He would graduate from Harvard and soon marry Rose, daughter of Boston Mayor John Honeyfitz Fitzgerald, famed for his political clout and his singing of Sweet Adeline in a lilting Irish tenor. Now, barely a generation away from poverty, Joseph Kennedy vastly enlarged the family fortunes, began the rapid accumulation of 4 sons and 5 daughters, and luxurious family citadels in Hyannisport and Palm Beach. At the age of 9, John Fitzgerald Kennedy could celebrate a gift of $1 million for his birthday. Cayman Newberry, a close friend and one-time classmate of Kennedy, recalls the family in the late 1930s.
Bobby was still a kid then, and frankly, rather a brat at that age. Joe Kennedy Jr. was, I think everybody will tell you this, was really, I suppose, the natural politician of the family. One wonders what would have happened if Joe hadn't been killed in the war, whether he might not have become president. If you ask me what do you remember most about Jack Kennedy, immediately I would say his humor. And by humor, it was his ability to make fun of himself. He very rarely made fun of other people. He was the butt of all his own jokes. He was a very enthusiastic person about no matter what he was doing. If he was lying in the sun trying to get a sunburn, he somehow made that a project. He made life a project. Kathleen was adorable. I think everybody who knew her had to be a little bit in love with Kathleen. She had such a zest for life. There was a family that when you went and stayed with them, they made you part of the family. They didn't treat you as a guest. I'll tell you what I think is marvelous about Jack Kennedy. He made you feel that you were probably his best friend.
Somehow, in footloose fashion, interrupted by bouts of illness, John Kennedy was educated. He attended several colleges at home and abroad, spent a semester in London where his father had been appointed ambassador to the court of St. James, graduated cum laude from Harvard in 1940. Briefly, he went west to Stanford.
He was going to business school, and he was there for 1 quarter, and he was quite a colorful fellow on campus. He had bought a Buick convertible out of the proceeds from his book, While England Slept. And here you have this attractive young, bright man driving around in his Buick convertible, and there are a lot of attractive, bright women down there at Stanford, and they seem to get together.
Remote from the workaday world of ordinary Americans, John Kennedy would later confess that he only knew of the Great Depression of the 1930s by reading about it at Harvard. But now, a shadow fell on playtime. With World War II came the first of a series of tragedies that ultimately would bring violent death to 4 of the Kennedy children. In it, Joseph Kennedy Jr., oldest son being groomed for a promising political career, was lost on a secret air mission. Later, Kathleen would be killed in an air crash in France. As a Navy lieutenant commanding the PT-109, John Kennedy himself won medals, but nearly lost his life when his attack craft was sheared in half and sunk by a Japanese destroyer off the Solomon Islands. Later, invalided, back from the Pacific, Kennedy was sent to the Chelsea Naval Hospital near Boston. After the war, working as a special correspondent for the International News Service, Kennedy covered both the founding of the United Nations at San Francisco and the Potsdam Conference of Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. But Kennedy would find himself restless as a bystander at great events. He cared less about reporting the news than in making it. For the first time, with Joseph Jr. gone, he began to think of a political career. During his wartime convalescence from malaria and a troublesome back injury, he could see the distant tower of the Old North Church, still marking the birth of our nation in its revolutionary past. Not far away lay City Hall, close to family history, scene of spirited and sometimes squalid political battles. Between these two poles, the dream and the down-to-earth business of daily practical politics, Kennedy would set his course. The war over, Kennedy decided to try his luck in the rough and tumble of Boston politics, enlisted the aid of fellow veterans. Longtime associate Dave Powers recalls,
I think I was been in politics seriously was when young Jack Kennedy knocked on my door on the third floor of a three-decker in Charlestown in January of 1946. He was this tall, thin, handsome young man, and he stuck out his hand in the semi-darkness. I think we had a 15-watt bulb. They had to keep down expenses, and he said he was Jack Kennedy. He was a candidate for Congress. I never saw anyone work like Jack did, and that was true in that 46 campaign as he climbed the tenements. He shook more hands and kissed more babies than the other 9 candidates together. The key was this veteran bit. See, in 46, if you did not have the word veteran beside your name, you couldn't be elected dog catcher. One time at a rally, a fellow stood up and said, hey, Kennedy, where are you from? New York, Palm Beach, Cape Cod? You're a carpetbagger. He walked over the front of the stage and said, nobody asked me my address when I was on a PT boat in the Solomon Islands. And the crowd loved it.
Rallying friends and family for the Boston campaign, Kennedy received a major boost from his own grandfather, Honey Fitzgerald, one-time mayor of the city. But sometimes the booster threatened to take over the show. Former Navy pal Red Fay remembers.
We went down to the City Hall to meet all the civil servants down there. I loved it because he brought the candidate down there to meet them, but he got so carried away, he started singing Sweet Adeline, and Jack had to keep saying, don't forget who the candidate is.
Helped by the Kennedy name and money, the Irish vote, his war record, and his ready platform presence and charm, Kennedy won the first of 3 terms as a congressman from Massachusetts.
John F. Kennedy's 6 years in the House were not outstanding in his opinion or in the opinion of his friends as well as his critics.
He was not really big at politics. He would talk about it on a broad scale. But as far as being the committee chairman and who was going to become the majority leader and who was going to do this and that, this was something that at that early days he was not greatly interested in.
Won't you tell us about some of the interesting objects surrounding you here?
Yes, I'd be glad to. This is a model of a PT boat in which I served during the war. And then here we have a picture of...
Details of Kennedy's personal life sometimes seem more memorable. For all his proven bravery, the hero of the Solomon Islands was afraid of the common cold. Old friend Cayman Newberry recalls being caught in the rain at a baseball game.
So this occasion when we got into the car and his clothes were sopping wet, I think he said, oh, I'm going to catch a terrible cold. I better get out of these clothes. Well, to my amazement and later on to my horror, he not only removed his shirt, socks, shoes, trousers, but also his underwear. And there I am driving a young congressman from Massachusetts through downtown Washington at 12:30 at night, stark naked. I said, Jack, you know, if we're stopped for a traffic violation or an accident, this is going to look very, very peculiar indeed. Well, he said, I don't care. I don't care. I'd rather be arrested for public indecency than catch my death of cold.
Despite his indifferent record in Congress, Kennedy was impatient to move up the political ladder. In 1952, he made the daring decision to run for the Senate against the popular and patrician Republican opponent, Henry Cabot Lodge.
Every weekend, we ran the teas and receptions in 35 different communities. The first one was held in Worcester, and 5,000 women attended.
Of course, Cabot Lodge, after the campaign, would refer to those damn tea parties. And they were very effective. He was the first person to ever organize, as far as I can remember, small parties in people's houses all over the state of Massachusetts.
We're going down to the North End at the Michelangelo School to a rally, and a car pulled up, and Henry Cabot Lodge is in it. And he put down the window, and he leaned out, and he said, "Hey, Jack, what a hell of a way to make a living." People liked both of them. You know, they were both Harvard. They were both had great war records. They were fine gentlemen, and the average voter in Massachusetts said, "Too bad we can't have Kennedy and Lodge."
Credited with having shaken the hands of more than 70,000 women at teas and receptions across the state, Kennedy scored an upset victory over Lodge by an almost identical margin of votes. While wooing the woman's vote, Kennedy had been pursuing a more private courtship, this time the daughter of a socially prominent family, Jacqueline Bouvier, then working as a photographer for a Washington paper. At 32, after a notable career as a man about town, Kennedy's bachelor days came to an end.
There were 1,200 at the wedding, and everywhere you looked, you saw a congressman, a senator, or a celebrity, or Kennedy or Fitzgerald. They built a dance floor right on the grass there, and you're looking out, you could see horses and cows, and I think the Maya Davis's Society band played there. It was a beautiful day. Everything about it was sensational.
Returning to Washington with his bride, Kennedy began a period of tranquil happiness at home and hard work in the Senate. Hardly a year later, he suffered an alarming interruption when in the winter of 1954-55, his recurrent back ailment twice required major corrective surgery. Even after a long and uncertain convalescence at Palm Beach, pain would remain an intermittent companion for the rest of his life.
I was with him when he took his first step. He put his feet in the salt water by the beach. I never saw a person so happy that he realized he had it beat. And from then on, it was go, go, go.
It is now my privilege to present to this convention, as a candidate for President of the United States, the name of the man uniquely qualified by virtue of his compassion, his conscience, and his courage.
No pain now could still his ambitions. After nominating Adlai Stevenson at the 1956 Democratic Convention in Chicago, Kennedy himself was nominated for vice president and lost by a narrow margin.
Florida now casts 17 1/2 sunshine votes for Senator Kefauver, 10 1/2 for Senator Kennedy.
Recognizing that this convention has selected a man who has campaigned in all parts of the country, who has worked entirely for the party, who will serve as an admirable running mate to Governor Stevenson, I hope that this convention will make Estes Kefauver's nomination unanimous. Thank you.
And now it is my pleasure to present the next Vice President of the United States.
Though sobered by defeat, it was as if a door had suddenly opened and closed. But in that brief moment, he had glimpsed the future that lay beyond.
He said, I couldn't back away from a challenge. With about 24 hours work, I came within 30.5 votes of winning the second spot. And then he added, if we all work like hell the next 4 years, I'll pick up all the marbles.
his shot at the vice presidency was a great indication of the fact that he's ready to go. He was getting ready to go.
Steadily broadening his ties to Democratic leaders across the country, Kennedy began to seek a wider public. At the risk of seeming anti-labor, he joined the Senate committee investigating labor racketeering, clashed with Teamster boss James Hoffa.
But you did not break off your agreement, which you could have done.
I would like to say, Senator, that if you're trying to penalize the American labor movement for Hoffa, or for your dislike for Hoffa, then spell it out in the law, exempting everybody except Hoffa. Will you please?
Well, we're exempting everyone but racketeers and hoodlums and crooks.
I would like to have you draft that language, sir.
I'm not talking necessarily about you. I'm talking about the people you've surrounded yourself with.
Well, I would like to say, sir, I don't accept their judgment on any issue when they're silly enough to accept this law.
When he saw an opportunity, he grabbed it, and I suspect that they sensed that the McClellan Committee, even though labor was a big factor, nevertheless, there was the chance to be in the center of things.
I think it is clear that we are not going to get rid of the Dave Becks and the Jimmy Hoffers in this country until we also get rid of the Nathan Shefferman and other employer agents who use subversive means.
In 1958, Kennedy again won his Senate seat by the widest margin in Massachusetts history. But already, he had further plans, already had enlisted the help of a young investigator and former journalist he had met during the Hoffa hearings, Pierre Salinger.
And so in September of 1959, I resigned from the Senate Labor Rackets Committee, and with a small group of people moved into an office in the Esso building. It was a very tiny little building at the foot of Capitol Hill. We were about 8, and on the door it said the office of Stephen E. Smith. It was a well-camouflaged pre-election office, and by that time I had talked to John and Robert Kennedy, and I had received my assignment, which was to prepare the press campaign for the 1960 election.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
Now the Democratic candidate, John Kennedy's opening salvo in the presidential campaign would be his acceptance speech at the party convention in Los Angeles.
Let me say first that I accept the nomination of the Democratic Party. I accept it without reservation and with only one obligation, the obligation to devote every effort of my mind and spirit to lead our party back to victory and our nation to greatness. I am grateful, too, that I can rely in the coming months on many others, on a distinguished running mate who brings unity and strength to our platform and our ticket, Lyndon Johnson. On my traveling companion in Wisconsin and West Virginia, Senator Hubert Humphrey. We know it will not be easy to campaign against a man who has spoken and voted on every side of every issue. Mr. Nixon may feel that it's his turn now, after the New Deal and the Fair Deal. But before he deals, someone's going to cut the cards.
For all his youthful energy and eloquence, Kennedy suffered critical handicaps. He was still a new figure in national politics, still seemed a stylish alien on the street corners of Middle America, still faced a press 80% Republican-owned. In Richard M. Nixon, he would confront a formidable opponent, better known as a national leader after his years as vice president, an experienced and often pitiless political infighter.
The Republican candidate for the presidency is running on a platform that you've never had it so good. I think we can do better. I think we are a great country, but we can be a greater country. And I think we're a powerful country, but I think we can be more powerful. And the Democratic Party says of the 60s, yes, we want to move forward. And the Republican Party has said in the last 8 years, as it has said in every administration in this century, it has said no to progress. It has vetoed progress. It has had a program of no new start. And on education and housing and distressed area and employment, this country has been standing still.
But the Catholic issue, beaten back in the West Virginia primary, remained an ugly hazard.
We knew that some of the well-organized bigots in the country were already at work spreading the word. If he became president, the Pope would arrive shortly thereafter in the United States.
God be merciful unto us and bless us.
In characteristic style, Kennedy responded. He met the challenge head-on. Flying to Houston, he would next challenge American anti-Catholic prejudice before a conference of Protestant clergy.
While the so-called religious issue is necessarily and properly the chief topic here tonight, I want to emphasize from the outset that I believe that we have far more critical issues in the 1960 campaign. But because I am a Catholic, and no Catholic has ever been elected president, the real issues in this campaign have been obscured, perhaps deliberately, in some quarters less responsible than this. So it is apparently necessary for me to state once again, not what kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, but what kind of America I believe in. I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source. And this is the kind of America I fought for in the South Pacific and the kind my brother died for in Europe. No one suggested then that we might have a divided loyalty, that we did not believe in liberty, or that we belonged to a disloyal group that threatened, I quote, the freedoms for which our forefathers died. And in fact, this is the kind of America for which our forefathers did die. When they fought at the shrine I visited today, the Alamo. For side by side with Bowie and Crockett died Fuentes and McCafferty and Bailey and Bedillo and Carey, but no one knows whether they were Catholics or not, for there was no religious test there. I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. For without reservation, I can, and I quote, solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, so help me God.
Soundly applauded by most for his forthright and reasoned stand in Houston, Kennedy would next face a far larger audience. Challenged by Nixon, he had quickly agreed to join in a series of national television debates.
When that offer came, I mean, it took us about 10 seconds to decide that we were going to accept that offer. I mean, we had nothing to lose. Richard Nixon had a worldwide reputation as a debater. I mean, he'd come off the kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev when he'd been in the Soviet Union. His reputation as a debater was made. John Kennedy was a relative unknown.
And the main problem was how to deal with Nixon, how to be firm but not insulting, how to handle Nixon.
My colleagues and I on the staff spent hours quizzing him, briefing him, cross-examining him. We prepared little index cards on virtually every issue.
Nixon didn't have the stamina, by the way, that Kennedy had. That's a big factor in this matter, of how you look and how you act.
When the time came for the debate, he was like a well-conditioned fighter brought to the peak of his fighting ability.
I come out of the Democratic Party, which in this century has produced Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and which supported and sustained these programs which I've discussed tonight. Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment. Called to blame the 4 Republicans for the 8 Democrats not getting something through that particular committee. I would say further that to blame the president and his veto power for the inability of the senator and his colleague to get action in this special session misses the mark. When the president exercises his veto power, he has to have the people behind him, not just a third of the Congress. Because let's consider it. If the majority of the members of the Congress felt that these particular proposals were good issues, majority of those who were Democrats, why didn't they pass them and send them to the president and get a veto and have an issue? The reason why these particular bills in these various fields that have been mentioned were not passed was not because the president was against them. It was because the people were against them. It was because they were too extreme.
Let's look at these bills that the vice president suggests were too extreme. One was a bill for $1.25 an hour for anyone who works in a store or a company that has $1 million a year business. I don't think that's extreme at all. And yet nearly 2/3 to 3/4 of the Republicans in the House of Representatives voted against that proposal. Secondly was the federal aid to education bill. It was a very, because of the defeat of teachers' salaries, it was not a bill that met, in my opinion, the needs. The fact of the matter is, it was a bill that was less than you recommended, Mr. Nixon, this morning in your proposal. The third is medical care for the aged, which is tied to Social Security, which is financed out of Social Security fund. Does not put a deficit on the Treasury. The proposal advanced by you and by Mr. Javits would have cost $600 million. Mr. Rockefeller rejected it in New York, said he didn't agree with the financing at all, said it ought to be on Social Security. So these are 3 programs which are quite moderate. I think it shows the difference between the 2 parties. One party is ready to move in these programs, the other party gives them lip service.
About 85% of the people who made a decision to vote for or against a candidate as a result of the debates did so on the basis of the first debate. These studies show that while the overwhelming number of people who saw the debate believed that John Kennedy had won them, an equally overwhelming number of people who only heard the debates, didn't have a television set, thought that Richard Nixon had won them. So it was the combination of what you were saying plus how you looked as you said it that was so important.
Kennedy was probably the first individual who knew how to use television for political purposes. He had a great personality. He was attractive in appearance. He was very articulate. And of course, this new means of projection for a politician was right up his alley.
I believe that we have to do in our generation what Franklin Roosevelt did in his generation.
The real crowd started to come out after the first debate, and the next day was like a transformation of the campaign. All of a sudden, the crowds were bigger. People were yelling, "You really got him last night, go get him again." He had turned people on by that debate. We started out by having 2 or 3 reporters on these trips, and then we'd have 5, and then we'd have 7 or 8, and I mean, the group got bigger and bigger and bigger until election night. We had something like 400 journalists traveling with us.
A Kentuckian. I married a Massachusetts girl. Can you state as evasively as Nixon would under the circumstances which state, Kentucky or Massachusetts, produces the most beautiful women?
Taking a leaf out of the Vice President's book, my wife comes from New York, and therefore I will say that New York produces the most beautiful women.
Do you like a man who answers straight, a man who's always fair? We'll measure him against the others, and when you compare, you'll cast your vote for Kennedy and the change that's overdue. So it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Yes, it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
would put the candidate to bed and sit down with the pilot and figure how late he could sleep. I had figured that he could dress and eat and shave in 27 minutes.
Because it's Columbus Day, we ought to have a speech in Italian.
Cari amici, mi fa davvero piacere essere tra di voi. Mio marito ed io vi siamo grati di tutti i cuori per la bella accoglienza. Grazie.
The way he campaigned that last 2 weeks, I'd say he averaged between 18 hours and 20 hours a day.
He had to pace himself because, as you know, he was always in extreme pain. He had had this back injury during the war, and it never left him. He'd had an operation in 1956, and he had to have stops when he could have a very, very hot tub and sink into the tub and relax the pain on his back.
I used to be able to get him out of bed in the morning when he'd be exhausted by saying, "Nixon's already been campaigning an hour."
At last, the great push was over. On election night, the Kennedy clan, friends and hard-headed campaign team, the so-called Irish Mafia, gathered at Hyannisport to await the returns. But it would be a long night.
It was the last time I called him Jack. I said, "Jack, how can you go to bed now?" I said, "We crisscrossed this country for a couple of years." And what a great answer. He said, "Because it's too late to change another boat."
Morning would bring victory, but by the narrowest margin in the history of United States presidential elections. More pensive than jubilant, the president-elect considered the responsibilities of victory. Quickly, he began to choose members of his administration, some old associates, some new. Historian Arthur Schlesinger, a friend since his days as senator, recalls Kennedy's invitation to join the executive team.
He said, "I hope you're going to come down and be in the White House." And I said, "I would be greatly thrilled to do that, but I'm not altogether clear what I will be doing." And to which he replied, "Well, I'm not altogether clear what I will be doing either, but I'm sure there'll be plenty to keep us both busy."
Perennial Jack Kennedy. He never had any money in his wallet. And so when they started to pass the collection, and as you can imagine, going to church in Georgetown, every eye in the church was on the president, the new president of the United States. And we're sitting there, and he leaned over and he said, "Redhead, slip me a 10. And I reached in my wallet, and all I had was a 20. And I knew that was the end of my 20, that I'd never see it again. So he takes the 20. When he drops it in, I have nothing to give. And he said, then he leans over to me and he says, "I want them to know they have a generous president."
Imports with a purpose. Colt for '84. A great buy for the money. Imported for Dodge and Plymouth. Colt gives you front-wheel drive. Room for 5. Money-saving mileage. And miles of just plain driving fun. So if you're thinking GLC, Civic, Sentra, or Tercel, think Colt too. And check out its really low sticker price. The '84 Colt, imported for Dodge and Plymouth. Built by Mitsubishi to give you a phenomenal import value.
Now that's a purpose.
I know my Bank of America Versatile card makes it easier to bank in California, but now I can use it from here to here. Introducing the new Plus System Automated Teller Network. Now, with your Versatile card, you can bank at locations around the country where you see this symbol. Get a Versatile card. It's the easy way to get your money nationwide.
Bank on the leader. Bank of America.
Monsignor, there's a phone call for you. Will McDonough?
Will.
Says you played football together.
That we did. That we did.
Think of all the times you thought about calling old friends and haven't done it. And think about how good it will make them feel. Old friends are only as far away
so much left to say.
as you let them be.
Don't drift away.
Golden fried chicken.
Can I help? Sure.
The best fried chicken we do. Banquet golden fried chicken. Banquet makes its best for you.
New Banquet Golden Fried Chicken, the truly premium frozen fried chicken with bigger, meatier pieces than ever before.
Banquet makes its best for you.
New Banquet Golden Fried Chicken, the premium fried chicken.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
In Washington's wintry sunlight, the ritual was old, but the voice was new. At 43, the youngest president in United States history, his words echoed in the mind and heart, awakened old beliefs. In them, we seemed to rediscover some forgotten dimension within ourselves. Yet amid the high summons of Inauguration Day, Kennedy had not lost his sense of the comic, of occasional self-mockery that would become the hallmark of his administration and his personal style.
Then we went back to the White House, to the Oval Office, and Teddy came back with us, and we were in the Oval Office, and Jack sat down in the chair and spun around at his desk, and he said, "Redhead, do you think it's adequate?" And I said, "Any second, somebody's going to walk through these doors and say, 'Are you three out of here?'"
It was Mr. President, and every day he looked more like Mr. President than the day before. And one time, a member of the press asked him what his favorite song was, and he said, "I think that Hail to the Chief has a nice ring to it."
Though previous and later administrations were often plagued by reports of intramural rivalries and feuds, few such problems dogged the Kennedy team.
It was generally understood that the Secretary of State was the senior advisor to the President on foreign policy matters. George Bundy, Bob McNamara, and I worked with each other very closely. We were very conscious of the fact that we were serving the same president.
Kennedy and Johnson liked and respected each other. Kennedy thought Johnson was something of a rogue, but he was entertained by him. He thought he was a highly intelligent, powerful man, and valued his opinion on things.
We once wrote in Time a little item that Bobby was the second most powerful man in the world. And I happened to have an appointment to see the president that morning, and I went in, and he was on the telephone. And he looked up rather contemptuously at me and said, "I'm speaking with the second most powerful man in the world this morning. Do you want to tell him anything?" I said, "Not this morning, Mr. President." There was a little more conversation, and John Kennedy looked up and said, "Bobby wants to know who number one is."
want to express my great satisfaction in signing the bill to increase the minimum wage to $1.25 an hour.
Quickly, the president moved on a broad front of domestic issues: health insurance, housing, aid to education, the minimum wage. Though he advocated an arms buildup against communism, he also knew that against hopelessness and hunger, the silent allies of tyranny, there are better weapons than a gun.
Peace Corps was very close to Kennedy's heart. He had this belief, and I think it was a true belief, that there were these untapped reserves of idealism in the American people. One of the things he was particularly concerned about was restoring American relations in the Western Hemisphere. And the Alliance for Progress really proceeded out of plans which the Latin Americans themselves had come up with. And the idea was to combine economic assistance with structural reform in Latin America, reform in tax systems and landowning systems, and with the support of democratic processes in Latin America.
But amid early hopes and positive actions, Kennedy soon encountered a series of explosive crises. In the first challenge to his administration, he became an unprepared accomplice in an ignominious failure.
There was a kind of delusive calm, I would say, during the Eisenhower period. In fact, the United States was very active. The CIA overthrew governments in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, tried to overthrow a government in Indonesia in 1958, overthrew a government in Laos in 1959, prepared to try to overthrow a government in Cuba in 1960. That last effort project, of course, was inherited by the Kennedy administration and became the Bay of Pigs.
Advised by both the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA that an invasion of Cuba by a brigade of Cuban nationals could overthrow the Castro government, Kennedy agreed to allow the U.S. invasion to proceed.
Well, the Bay of Pigs was the most ghastly mistake that we made during those years. I think I badly served President Kennedy with regard to the Bay of Pigs because I did not press him to ask a question which he did not ask. He should have turned to our Joint Chiefs of Staff and said, "Now, gentlemen, I may want to do this with American forces." If President Kennedy had had a chance to contrast what our own Joint Chiefs of Staff thought they would need with the capabilities of this little brigade, he could have seen readily that this little brigade didn't have the chance of a snowball in hell.
John F. Kennedy deserves high marks for being willing to take the full blame and responsibility for the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs.
This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them.
Other trials were being prepared. In January, Soviet Chairman Khrushchev had made a belligerent speech, generally accepted as the usual test of a new United States president. Yet Kennedy felt he must avoid the automatic knee-jerk reactions common in United States-Soviet relations.
I remember early in his administration when he found the book, The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. And he said, "That's the best handbook I've had on being president that I've ever read." And he said, "It's a book about stupidity." He said, "You know, it's a book about August 1914, the start of World War I. And he said how one man would make a misjudgment, and then another one would not bother to get the facts, and he'd base his action on that misjudgment, and the thing would pyramid until you had the apocalypse of World War I. And he said that can happen now.
The summit meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna in June '61, Mr. Khrushchev, in a rather brutal kind of fashion, tried to intimidate this new young president of the United States by throwing at him an ultimatum on Berlin. Mr. Khrushchev started off with a long ideological tirade about the bases of communism and all the rest of it. Well, when he got through, Mr. Kennedy, in effect, said to him, "Now, Mr. Chairman, you're not going to make a communist out of me, and I'm not going to make a capitalist out of you. So let's get down to business."
The result of that discussion on Berlin was a more threatening and menacing attitude by the Soviet Union and a more determined response by the United States. And the two principals then returned to their respective capitals to get ready for what looked like a very difficult year.
I am tomorrow requesting the Congress for the current fiscal year an additional $3,247 million of appropriations for the armed forces to fill out our present Army divisions and to make more men available for prompt deployment. I am requesting an increase in the Army's total authorized strength from 875,000 to approximately 1 million men. 3, I am requesting an increase of 29,000 and 63,000 men, respectively, in the active duty strength of the Navy and the Air Force. It would be a mistake for others to look upon Berlin because of its location as a tempting target. The United States is there. The United Kingdom and France are there. The pledge of NATO is there. And the people of Berlin are there. It is as secure in that sense as the rest of us, for we cannot separate its safety from our own.
It had been a sobering first year. For the first time, Kennedy had learned limits, both on presidential authority and on national power. That our best hope lay not in self-deception and the dangerous illusion of omnipotence, but in the clear recognition of reality. It marked a major step in his growth and would shape crucial decisions yet to come. Looking back on that first year, Hugh Sidey of Time magazine remembers,
that whole Southeast Asian picture was worsening. No sooner were we through the Bay of Pigs than the Russians began to put the screws on Berlin. And Khrushchev, in that last meeting with Kennedy, hammered the table and said, "Berlin is a bone in my throat. I want it out." And one morning, I think it was July or August, he was out on the Honey Fits and the Berlin Wall began to go up. So there was the Berlin Wall. Then our scientists had predicted that it would take the Soviets about 7 years to equal us in building those monster hydrogen bombs. In fact, we discovered in August they were shooting them off already, years before our experts had thought they would be technically capable of doing that. So that by the fall of 1961, I went in to see John Kennedy one night, and he said, "I'm going to give this damn job to Nixon."
John F. Kennedy never stopped growing, and it was his exposure to new problems that accounted for much of that growth. Before he toured West Virginia and southern Illinois and other poverty-stricken areas of the United States in the course of his campaign for the presidency, he had never seen Americans forced to live under such conditions. And it touched him, it moved him deeply, and he was determined to do something about it as president. Similarly, his experiences had never exposed him to the kind of brutal treatment of blacks which he learned as president was being meted out to many of the black citizens in the South and elsewhere. And that moved him, and he was determined that something had to be done about it.
During Kennedy's first year, the main challenges had been in foreign affairs. Now, they came from within the nation itself. For more than 100 years, refused the rights and opportunities enjoyed by other Americans, black citizens were demanding that the United States at last live up to the guarantees of the Constitution. Blacks would no longer ride at the back of the bus. From across the South and elsewhere came daily reports of marches, confrontation, and riot.
The Civil Rights Revolution was underway. John F. Kennedy didn't start that revolution, but neither could he have stopped it had he wanted to. It was underway in the streets of the country, particularly in the South. It was aided by young people, North and South, who felt that the time had come for America to make good on its promise of equal opportunity. Each year of his presidency found John F. Kennedy more committed and more concerned on this issue. Until late 1962, he committed the full majesty of the federal government to see to it that a black man, James Meredith, was admitted to the University of Mississippi, no matter how many mobs or rioters tried to stand in his way.
The general belief was that there would be a terrible violence. I never really believed that there would be, but that was generally prevailing thought.
But the violence came. When it was over, it left a stalemate, tense and silent, in which a single spark might again cause an explosion.
Americans are free, in short, to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For any government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law. If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men, by force or threat of force, could long deny the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt.
The soldiers left at the end of the first year. They stayed 1 year. The marshals stayed the entire time. There was never a time on the campus where I was not accompanied by marshals.
Both by his individual actions and speeches as president and by the legislative program that he sent to Congress, President Kennedy, for the first time in history, placed the presidency at the front of that civil rights march and declared that hereafter neither legally nor morally could racial segregation and discrimination take place in the United States.
As black leaders such as Martin Luther King rallied a nationwide campaign, Kennedy asserted the full authority of the federal government for equal rights.
I come over here tonight to tell you that you are God's children, and that every man from a base black to a treble white is significant on God's keyboard. I come over here to let you know.
For the first time, violent racists and bigots and those who supported them by passive assent were on the defensive. At Lincoln Memorial, King voiced the anguished hope of a century of denial.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. One day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. This will be the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at
last. There was another dream undimmed by hatred or bigots, but only in the wild inventions of Jules Verne and other fantasists had men imagined traveling to distant planets. Less than half a century had passed since such a feat seemed remotely possible, but the technological demands and the cost seemed prohibitive until the Soviets placed a man in orbit. Quickly, Kennedy pledged to put a man on the moon. The race for space was on.
I've spoken about the new frontier. This is not a partisan term, and it's not the exclusive property of Republicans or Democrats. It refers instead to this nation's place in history, to the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity, an era to be characterized by achievement and by challenge. It is an era which calls for action, and for the best efforts of all those who would test the unknown and the uncertain in every phase of human endeavor. It is a time for pathfinders and pioneers.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
He was responding to a challenge at that time. We had been very proud in this nation that we were the preeminent nation in the world in engineering, science, things technical. We had provided rising standards of living all throughout our history. And it seems to me that if there was one spirit that sort of imbued the whole Kennedy years, it was that feeling of excitement, of excellence, that we can do better, and we're going to set goals, we're going to go for it. And the whole country was sort of excited about that.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. It will be an entire nation.
For untold centuries, man had looked outward into the heavens. Now, for the first time, returning astronauts could look inward toward the small planet that was home to the wayward and contentious creature called man. Threatened now by nuclear apocalypse, it seemed inexpressibly valuable. Hanging in the darkness of space, it shone bright as springtime, pretty as an apple on a tree.
In the summer and early fall of 1962, as signs of increased Soviet military activity in Cuba continued to mount, President Kennedy, on more than one occasion, publicly as well as privately, warned the Soviets that there were limits to Soviet military activity in the Caribbean that the United States could tolerate. When he called me in on one morning in mid-October to tell me that our overflights of Cuba had in fact identified Soviet missile camps on that island, he was determined not to let it go by. He felt that this was a challenge from which the United States could not back down.
Well, I think there was some initial skepticism about the existence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. These damned aerial photographs meant a lot to the decoders of the photographs, but they didn't mean much to anyone else. To the lay eye, you didn't know what they proved.
But when we then got the air photos of the duplication in Cuba of the exact kind of missile site which we were familiar with in the Soviet Union, then we could watch the construction of these missile sites on almost an hourly basis, from empty pastures to a missile site. Then we knew we had a real crisis on our hands.
Immediately, on October 16, Kennedy formed a top-secret group to devise a response to the threat rising in Cuba. Called the ExComm, or Executive Committee of the National Security Council, this small assembly of civilian and military advisors would meet almost continuously for the next 13 days. To avoid national alarm, the president maintained his usual schedule, resolved to avoid any public statements or news leaks until a course of action had been determined. As the ExComm considered alternative steps, Kennedy received a previously scheduled visit from Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Again, the minister repeated Soviet disavowals of any aggressive preparations in Cuba, unaware that the president had clear photographic evidence in his desk. While the armed services rapidly prepared for the worst, the ExComm debate continued. Some advisors urged an immediate airstrike, an invasion of Cuba. Others recommended a more gradual application of force, beginning with a blockade of the island, thus avoiding a premature commitment to all-out war. Not until Saturday, October 20, did the president receive word in Chicago that the ex-com was ready to offer opposing recommendations. Returning, Kennedy next day heard the proposals. Dean Rusk remembers.
Well, we knew that this crisis had to be resolved rather quickly, or it would become a different ballgame. Because we never saw a warhead on a missile on a launcher ready to fire in Cuba. We wanted to get this crisis resolved before that situation occurred.
Kennedy decided on the more cautious strategy of blockade or quarantine, simultaneously placing heavier forces into position if invasion became necessary and war with the Soviet Union loomed. While enlisting the support of other European and American nations, the administration moved armored forces into Florida and the Southeast. A growing fleet spread into the Caribbean. B-52 bombers were dispersed and some kept continuously airborne. On Monday evening, 7 days after the beginning of the crisis, the president made his first report to the nation.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The quarantine of Cuba began at 10 o'clock on the morning of Wednesday, October 24. Its perimeter first had been set at 800 miles, but then reduced to 500 to permit Khrushchev more time to consider the dangers of confrontation. Amid rising tension in the White House, the first Russian ships approached the quarantine barrier. Then, at 10:32 a.m., came word that several ships had halted, or actually were turning. But the relaxation was short-lived. Quickly came further reports of Soviet submarines entering the area, and a feverish speed-up of efforts to assemble bombers and missile installations in Cuba. Each indicated an attempt at a deceptive standoff in which the Soviets could use the time to its advantage. Again, the hours ticked away. Other nations were viewing the crisis with increasing alarm. At the United Nations, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted Soviet Representative Zorin.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
At the White House, hopes for a peaceful solution were fading. In quick succession, Kennedy received 2 letters from Khrushchev. The first, a personal conciliatory message. The second, more formal and demanding, apparently written by the Soviet Foreign Office. Then, on Saturday morning, U-2 pilot Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by Cuban SAM missiles. The war was at ignition point. But once more, Kennedy delayed a retaliatory strike for 1 more day, sent an answer to Khrushchev's conciliatory first letter, and ignored the second. Then, at last, on Sunday morning, October 28th, Ambassador Dobrynin brought the message that Khrushchev agreed to remove all missiles and bombers from Cuba under United States surveillance. The crisis was over.
It got pretty close there for a time. Mr. Khrushchev announced on Sunday that he was taking the missiles out. We had the capability of going into Cuba on the following Tuesday. I think both we and the Russians came out of that experience a little more prudent and sober than we had been before, because each side had had the chance to look down the cannon's mouth and did not like what they saw. If we had gone into Cuba and Khrushchev had gone into Berlin, then where would we have been? That would have been a real mess.
You don't shove somebody up against the wall, because when you do, they got to fight back. You give them some room for maneuver. You give them some room to reflect. And that's what he did with Khrushchev.
And it worked brilliantly. We avoided confrontation. The Soviets, in their peculiar system, could still save enough face. They got out of it. They took their missiles and planes back. And John Kennedy didn't gloat in victory. Very, very responsible, low-key response to it. It was a superb performance.
See, there are two important things about foreign policy that most people forget. One is that foreign policy is that part of our business which we ourselves cannot fully control. We can pretty much do what we decide to do here in our own country, but we go beyond our national frontier. And there are 160 or more nations out there, each one unique, each with its own problems and ambitions and hopes and aspirations, and no one of which simply salutes and snaps its heels when we speak. Most foreign policy decisions are made about the future, trying to shape the course of events in one way rather than another. But Providence in its mercy has not given us the capacity to pierce the fog of the future with accuracy. There are always things out there that you cannot know. There's no way to know with certainty how another living, breathing human being, like a Mr. Khrushchev, would react to a specific situation. There's no way to know that. And all the think tanks and all the psychologists and all the rest of them can't help you very much on that.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
After 2 years of almost unceasing crisis and risk, Kennedy's State of the Union address in January 1963 reflected a new assurance, even a cautious optimism. The president had hit his stride. Both he and Jackie had become the image of a young and vital nation.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the 88th Congress, I congratulate you all, not merely on your electoral victory, but on your selected role in history. For you and I are privileged to serve the great republic in what could be the most decisive decade in its long history. The choices we make, for good or ill, will affect the welfare of generations yet unborn. Little more than 100 weeks ago, I assumed the office of the President of the United States. In seeking the help of the Congress and our countrymen, I pledged no easy answers. I pledged and asked only toil and dedication. These the Congress and the people have given in good measure. And today, having witnessed in recent months a heightened respect for our national purpose and power, having seen the courageous calm of a united people in a perilous hour, and having observed a steady improvement in the opportunities and well-being of our citizens, I can report to you that the state of this old but youthful union is good.
White House galas were touched by a new grace, often enlivened by Kennedy's irreverent wit. At a dinner honoring Nobel Prize winners, he voiced the belief that it was the greatest assembly of talent and human knowledge gathered at the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined there alone. Even the intense questioning of regular press conferences was sometimes broken by a sudden presidential quip.
One reputable columnist, after talking to businessmen, obviously, reported this week their attitude is, now we have you where they want you. Have you seen any reflection of this attitude?
I can't believe I'm where business
big business wants me.
Khrushchev stated that communists could learn something even from capitalists, and he even had a few kind words to say about profit incentives. Do you read any great amount of significance into this?
No, I don't. No. Except human nature is the same on both sides, fortunately, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, which is why I'm optimistic about the ultimate outcome of this struggle.
For the moment, problems at home and abroad seemed within manageable dimensions. Though civil rights had far to go, its direction now seemed irreversible. In June, defying a federal court ordering the admission of 2 Negro students to the University of Alabama, Governor George Wallace swore to block the schoolhouse door. In quick response, the president federalized the National Guard, ordered the governor removed and the students enrolled. On television, Kennedy challenged the nation to honor not only the law, but its own sense of decency and fairness.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed?
Though committed to a buildup of United States military strength, Kennedy now had sober second thoughts on reducing the appalling threat of nuclear annihilation. Helped by personal messages between himself and Khrushchev after Cuba, he began to search for a more practical approach to peace than an exchange of threats.
I think President Kennedy recognized, and hoped that people in Moscow would recognize, that it is just too late in history for the 2 nuclear superpowers to pursue a policy of total hostility across the board. Because whatever we think of each other, at the end of the day, we still have to find some way to inhabit this speck of dust in the universe at the same time. Now, it was that kind of thinking that was in President Kennedy's mind. He was very pragmatic, down to earth, not very much impressed by ideology, either by theirs or by ours. If all the nuclear weapons that now lie around in the hands of frail human beings were to be exploded in some half-hour's agony someday, it would raise a serious question as to whether this planet could any longer sustain the human race. Well, if that be true or anywhere close to being true, then it's just as clear as night and day that we should find some way to put a halt to this arms race.
The Soviet people want the same thing we do. Basically, they'd like for their own nation to be secure against a threat from any possible attacker. At the same time, they want to prevent war coming to their own people.
I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our 2 countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. and we are all mortal. I'm taking this opportunity, therefore, to announce two important decisions in this regard. First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind.
Having joined conciliation with strength, the president began a brief European tour at a point of repeated contention in a Berlin encircled by communist East Germany and divided by a wall. Here and in later visits on his journey, it was overwhelmingly evident that Kennedy had become a rallying figure for the hopes of other peoples around the world.
He was just overwhelmed with the interest that they showed in him as the President of the United States. It was just unbelievable. And this picked up throughout the trip. And I could see this was having a tremendous effect on him. And when he was riding with Adenauer, he said, "Chancellor, do they turn out like this every time you celebrate something?" And Adenauer was very proud and pleased. He said, "No, they came for you, Mr. President."
A few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, "Ich bin ein Berliner."
The same day that he went by the Berlin Wall, we drove into Dublin that night. The crowds in Germany were bigger, but it was different in Ireland. They were welcoming home a cousin. When he drove up O'Connell Street in Dublin, 500,000 people turned out to see their cousin. And what a welcome. He made everyone so proud. The 4 days in Ireland were 4 of the happiest days of his life.
Again at home, he rejoined his family for quiet times aboard the Honey Fitz, offered critiques of his brother's seamanship as they sailed the family yacht. Sometimes he retreated to a new weekend home in Northern Virginia where Jackie could teach Caroline to ride and John could play soldier. The president himself could learn the dangers of offering sugar cubes to a pony. "Keep shooting," Kennedy told the photographer. "You are about to see a president eaten by a horse." It had been a summer of reassurance and accomplishment, climaxed by the president's most important symbolic victory, the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first major step toward arms reduction. It was for John Kennedy the golden moment of his administration.
One time he said, "Where are you going with that?" And I said, "I'm putting it in my file downstairs." He says, what file? I said, well, I've started a file called the 8-year file. And this, when you're through, well, you may need papers like this if you want to write about them. He said, you better also start a 4-year file. He said, you may be unduly optimistic.
Surrounded by increasing approval both at home and abroad, Kennedy had begun to prepare for a second term, to winning big in 1964. Yet, there remained some fence mending to be done within his own party. His strong civil rights stand had caused dissensions in the South, a traditional Democratic Party stronghold. In the fall of 1963, he prepared a trip to Houston and Dallas in an attempt to reduce some of the dangerous infighting between liberal and conservative elements in the Democratic ranks.
He and Jackie and Ken O'Donnell and I were going to sleep that night at LBJ's ranch. And then we were coming back, and the following week he was looking forward to it. Monday would be John's birthday, Wednesday was Caroline's birthday, and Thursday all the Kennedys were going to gather at Hyannisport. It was Thanksgiving Day. He was looking forward to the best years of his life and feeling better than he had ever been on that last day that we swam together in the White House, Wednesday, November 20th, 1963.
On November 21, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy set out on a journey from which he would never return. Killed by a bullet in Dallas, he joined the other receding figures of history. His life half-lived, his greatest task only begun. And we suddenly became mourners, grieving not only for him, but for ourselves, robbed of so bright a promise. For a little while, he had brought Americans closer to the colonnades of government. In his voice, we seemed to hear our own. He had reminded us that for all our differences, the nation still rests on the common trust of all its citizens, a great arch suspended upon itself, stone on stone. In peril and challenge, he had summoned the best that was in us. He spoke to us then, he speaks to us still.
Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world.